All right, so we've just been hearing Dewey's critiques of belief and knowledge, and he's introduced us a little bit to his term warranted assertability. This, by the way, is a famous term associated with Dewey. I think there's a certain amount of confusion about that. Some people don't like it. Um, some people like it, I suppose, but we'll, of course, be getting more into that eventually. But let's continue on here at the top of page 17. He's going to move now to talking about rationality and how he is going to define rationality. So a lot of Dewey's logic is going to be kind of defining, redefining, clarifying terms like this, important terms, and trying to give them a very careful meaning. So we've already seen that with kind of logic itself, looking at proximate and ultimate subject matters of logic, and then we just saw that with belief and knowledge. And now we're going to look at things like rationality and reason. So, top of page 17, he says, up to this point, it may seem as if the criteria that emerge from the processes of continuous inquiry were only descriptive and, in that sense, empirical. Right? So, remember how the logical forms emerge through the processes of inquiry, and in that sense, you could think of them as descriptive, as describing inquiry. That they are empirical in one sense of that ambiguous word is undeniable. They have grown out of the experiences of actual inquiry. But they are not empirical in the sense which empirical means devoid of rational standing. So there was an older idea of a division between the rational and the empirical, but I don't think it's worth getting too much into that right here. Yeah, so they're not rational, right? Through examination of the relations which exist between means, methods employed, and conclusions attained as their consequences, reasons are discovered why some methods succeed and other methods fail. So when you stand back and look at inquiry, some particular inquiry, you can see that some methods were successful, other methods were not successful, and looking at the relations about why means were attain certain conclusions, you discover reasons, the reasons why. Or I guess I should say, when you look at how certain methods led to certain conclusions, you discover why some methods succeed and other methods fail. So it is implied in what has been said as a corollary of the general hypothesis that rationality is an affair of the relation of means and consequences, not of fixed first principles as ultimate premises or as contents of what the neo-scholastics call criteriology. So the important thing here, the important idea here is that rationality is about the relation of means and consequences. When we call something rational, it means basically choosing the appropriate means for the consequences that you desire. A reasonableness or rationality is, according to the position here taken, as well as in its ordinary usage, an affair of the relation of means and consequences. In framing ends in view, it is unreasonable to set up those which have no connection with available means, and without reference to the obstacles standing in the way of attaining the end. So when you're deciding on your ends, it's unreasonable to choose ends which can't be gotten with available means, with the means at your disposal. It is reasonable to search for and select the means that will, with the maximum probability, yield the consequences which are intended. So it's reasonable to choose the right means. You got to have the right tools for the job, right? It is highly unreasonable to employ as means materials and processes which would be found if they were examined to be such that they produce consequences which are different from the intended end, so different that they preclude its attainment, right? So rationality is choosing the right means for the ends that you want and choosing ends that you have means for, that you have the means for attaining. Rationality as an abstract conception is precisely the generalized idea of the means-consequence relation as such. Yeah, so rationality as an abstract conception. So he was just talking about knowledge as an abstract conception, which is really just kind of covering all these specific cases where we go through a process of inquiry and get to something more settled, more certain. And so knowledge is just the abstract idea of that. And rationality here is just the generalized idea that you need to match your means and ends and choose ends that you have means for, and so on. Hence, from this point of view, going into the next page here, hence, from this point of view, the descriptive statement of methods that achieve progressively stable beliefs or warranted assertability is also a rational statement in the case of relation between them as means and assertability as consequence is ascertained. This is a complicated sentence. Let's look at that again. So, hence, from this point of view of the relation of rationality being a relation between means and ends, from this point of view, the descriptive statement of methods that achieve progressively stable beliefs, so that get us to more and more stable beliefs, remove more and more doubt, or warranted assertability. This descriptive statement is also a rational statement in case the relation between them, I think he means the methods as means, and assertability as consequence is ascertained. So it is also a rational statement in case the relation between them is ascertained. So to the extent that you know the actual relation between the means and the ends and the institution of certainty or assertability. All right, that's a bit of a difficult sentence, which you get from time to time in Dewey's writing. But I think it's just basically a summary of what he has already said. Going on to the next paragraph. Reasonableness or rationality has, however, been hypostatized. So it's been made into something kind of fixed and external to the process of inquiry, held up as something external, ultimate, not recognized as just a convenient abstraction pointing us to all these more specific things. One of the, so now he's getting into kind of a counter position to his own position. One of the oldest and most enduring traditions in logical theory has converted rationality into a faculty which, when it is actualized in perception of first truths, was called reason and later intellectus purus. The idea of reason as the power which intuitively apprehends the a priori ultimate first principles, persists in logical philosophy. So this is more of a rationalistic idea that you can, through contemplation, gain the certain a priori first principles that then would be used to guide inquiry, which is, of course, much different or opposed to Dewey's theory, where you are in the process of inquiry and you derive principles from what works and what doesn't work. But this other idea, this rationalistic principle, or this idea of having a faculty of reason which can grasp at a priori ultimate first principles, he says this persists in logical philosophy. Whether explicitly affirmed or not, it is the ground of every view which holds that scientific method is dependent upon logical forms that are logically prior and external to inquiry. Again, this is opposed to Dewey's view. This view that logical forms are prior, logically pre-existing inquiry. The original ground for this conception of reason has now been destroyed. This ground was the necessity for postulating a faculty that had the power of direct apprehension of truths that were axiomatic in the sense of being self-evident or self-verifying and self-contained as the necessary grounds of all demonstrative reasoning. So there was a ground for this earlier belief in a faculty of reason that could grasp these self-evident, self-verifying, self-contained truths. This ground no longer exists, according to Dewey. And this is his difference between kind of these non-modern philosophies and new, more modern philosophies. The notion was derived from the subject matter that had attained the highest scientific formulation at the time the classic logic was formulated, namely Euclidean geometry. So a bit of a historical note here, that Euclidean geometry and the idea of having these kind of necessary truths from which other truths could be inferred was very powerfully very much a part of Euclidean, the system of the Euclidean geometry, and this had effects on how we thought about logic. But Dewey will get into this a little later, but now, of course, Euclidean geometry is not the only geometry in town, and so there are other ways of doing stuff, and Dewey's going to get into these other ways of doing things now, I believe. So this conception of the nature of axioms is no longer held in mathematics, nor in the logic of mathematics. Axioms, in the new view of mathematics, axioms are now held to be postulates, neither true nor false in themselves, and to have their meaning determined by the consequences that follow because of their implicatory relations to one another. So you have these different sets of axioms, postulates, and it doesn't matter whether they're true or false. You don't look at whether they're true or false, but you see what happens if you hold these as just functional for a particular case of inquiry. What happens if you just take these for granted, and what is implied by that? What can we infer on that basis by manipulating these postulates? The greatest freedom is permitted, or rather encouraged, in laying down postulates, a freedom subject only to the condition that they be rigorously fruitful of implied consequences. Yeah, and then the same principle holds in physics. So mathematical formulae have now taken the place in physics once occupied by propositions about eternal essences and the fixed species defined by these essences. So math mathematics is a useful tool in physics rather than taking up these specific essences or propositions about essences. We use mathematical formulas and manipulate mathematical formulas to see what comes out of that. The formulae are deductively developed by means of rules of implication. And some of this will be explained in more detail later. I don't want to spend too much time on this aspect right now, so we'll kind of plow through this mathematics stuff. There will be chapters on that later on. But the value of the deduced result for physical science is not determined by the correctness of the deduction. And why? So the deductive conclusion is used to instigate and direct operations of experimental observation. So the deduction doesn't need to be true in and of itself. The outcomes of these formulas don't need to be true in and of themselves. They need to be useful in directing our observation, directing operations of experimental observation. The observable consequences of these operations in their systematic correlation with one another finally determine the scientific worth of the deduced principle. So it's the observed consequences that ultimately matter in terms of verifying, or I guess maybe verifying is not the right word, but showing the scientific worth, as he says, showing the scientific worth of the deduction. The latter takes its place. So the deduced principle, I think, takes its place as a means necessary to obtain the consequence of warranted assertability. Yeah, so it's taking a view of postulates and propositions. We'll have this view of propositions as means rather than ends. So a proposition is not the end of inquiry, or it can be the end of inquiry, but it's not an ultimate end. It's a means for further inquiry. A means of propositions are means of inquiry. Postulates are means of inquiry, and sometimes also the outcome of inquiry, but those outcomes then are themselves means for further inquiry. The position taken here, going into our last few sentences of this section, the position taken here, the general hypothesis advanced, is a generalization of the means-consequence relation characteristic of mathematical and physical inquiry. So Dewey is drawing from the mathematics and physics of his day, what people were doing at that time and the advances that had been made in terms of using things as means for particular consequences, as a more instrumentalist view of scientific or logical or mathematical or physical postulates or propositions. According to it, all logical forms, such as are represented by what has been called proximate logical subject matter, are instances of a relation between means and consequences in properly controlled inquiry. The word controlled in this statement, standing for the methods of inquiry that are developed and perfected in the process of continuous inquiry. So again, this idea of logical forms being progressively developed through inquiry and controlling that inquiry through a kind of a feedback cycle. You may think of it in that way. In this continuity, the conclusions of any special inquiry are subordinate to use in substantiation and maturation of methods of further inquiry. So yeah, the conclusions of any special inquiry are subordinate to use in substantiation and maturation of methods of further inquiry. So the conclusions of some limited inquiry are never final in themselves, never complete in themselves, but find their use, find their justification as the development of, as helping to develop further inquiry. The general character of knowledge as an abstract term is determined by the nature of the methods used, not vice versa.